Welcome, everyone. We're thrilled to present the full edition of Ilene's journey from heartbreak to happiness. What you're about to experience is a complete, uninterrupted story of a woman's incredible path from betrayal and heartbreak to rediscovering love and joy. Over the next half hour, you'll witness Ilene's emotional journey unfold in its entirety, with all 6 parts compiled into one powerful narrative. Whether you're new to Ilene's story or have been following along from the beginning, we hope you'll find this full edition to be a moving and rewarding experience. So grab a comfy blanket, settle in, and let's embark on this heartfelt journey together. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and follow us for more stories like this. Now let's dive into Ilene's remarkable journey.
Ilene had always thought that her marriage was built on a solid foundation. Sure, there had been tough moments over the years, but 15 years was no small feat. She had weathered the storms of life with Richard by her side, and despite the ups and downs, she believed they had something strong. That belief began to shatter the night Richard came to her with an unexpected request. They were sitting in the living room after dinner, the soft hum of the television playing in the background. Richard seemed tense, his fingers drumming on the armrest of the couch. Ilene had sensed something was off, but nothing could have prepared her for what came next. "I need to talk to you about something," he said, his voice heavy with an odd mixture of guilt and resolve. Ilene turned off the TV, giving him her full attention. "What's going on?" Richard took a deep breath, avoiding eye contact for a moment before looking directly into her eyes. "I've met someone." Her heart stopped for a second, the blood draining from her face. She felt the walls closing in, her breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice a whisper, as if afraid of the answer. "It's not what you think," he hurriedly said. "I haven't cheated, Ilene. I would never cheat on you." Relief barely registered before he continued. "But there's someone at work, Vivian. I'm attracted to her physically, that's all. There's no emotional connection. I don't want to be with her in any way other than sexually." Ilene's world began to spin. She stared at him, trying to process his words. "I don't want to go behind your back," he went on, his tone almost rehearsed. "I'm telling you because I respect you. I want us to open up the marriage." It felt like a punch to the gut. "What?" Her voice cracked, her hands trembling as she tried to keep herself together. "I want to sleep with her," Richard said, his words sounding hollow to Ilene. "But I don't want to lose you. This is just... it's physical. It doesn't mean I don't love you." Her mind raced. She could barely hear his justifications. How he wasn't interested in Vivian's mind. How it was purely a physical attraction. Maybe something to explore once, maybe more than once. It didn't matter. All she could focus on was the crack in their marriage that had suddenly become a gaping chasm. Richard kept talking as if offering her a lifeline, though to her it felt like a death sentence. "You can have the same freedom. I don't want to hold you back either. It'll be equal. But I need this." She didn't want freedom. She wanted her husband, the life they'd built together, the home they shared. She wanted her marriage. "I don't know what to say," she finally whispered, feeling tears prick at the corners of her eyes. How could you even ask me that?" "I didn't want to cheat, Ilene," he said again, his tone pleading now, like he was the one in need of forgiveness. I thought being honest would help." The rest of the conversation blurred. She didn't remember agreeing, didn't remember saying yes, but somehow she had let him go that night. She spent the entire evening on the couch, staring at the clock, her mind blank and full at the same time. When the door finally creaked open hours later, her heart raced, hoping he'd come back with regret in his eyes. But when Richard stepped inside, there was no apology in his expression. He simply walked to the bathroom, showered, and climbed into bed beside her. He didn't reach for her. He didn't say a word. For the first time in their 15 years together, Richard didn't hold her when he came to bed. Instead, he rolled over, his back facing her, and fell asleep. Ilene stared at the ceiling, tears streaming silently down her face. Something inside her broke that night, a fracture so deep she couldn't imagine it ever healing. The next morning, Richard acted as though nothing had changed. He greeted her with a soft good morning, but Ilene could barely look at him. He kissed her on the cheek before heading to work, and as soon as the door clicked shut behind him, Ilene made a decision. She wasn't going to fight for someone who didn't want to fight for her. Ilene moved swiftly. She contacted a lawyer that very day, laying out the details of her marriage and the quiet destruction it had suffered in the span of a single conversation. The lawyer had listened, her calm professionalism a balm to Ilene's turmoil. "Are you sure this is what you want?" the lawyer asked as she prepared the papers. Ilene hesitated, but only for a moment. "I'm sure." She couldn't tell Richard. Not yet. Not until she had everything in place. Instead, she spent the next few weeks going through the motions, watching as Richard came and went with Vivian, each time more painful than the last. She could hardly stand the sight of him anymore. His touch felt foreign, and his once comforting presence now suffocated her. But Richard didn't seem to notice. He thought everything was fine, until it wasn't. When Richard finally found the divorce papers, Ilene was at home, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. His eyes were wide, his hands shaking as he held the papers up. "What is this?" he demanded. Ilene didn't flinch. "It's what you wanted." "What? No, Ilene, this isn't what I wanted. I just wanted to explore. But our marriage, I never wanted to end this." Ilene's voice was cold, detached. "You ended it the moment you walked out that door to be with her." No, it was just sex, Ilene. I told you that. There was no emotional connection. I don't even want to see Vivian anymore. Please, we can close the marriage back up. We can go back to the way things were." But things could never go back. She watched him as he rambled on, pleading for a second chance, but all she could think about was how easy it had been for him to walk out on her, how simple it had been for him to betray her trust. "No, Richard," she finally said, her voice steady. "I'm done." The realization hit him slowly, his face crumbling as it sank in that this wasn't just a threat. This was the end. And as much as he begged, as much as he tried to backtrack, it was too late. Ilene had already decided to move on. Life after Richard was quieter, lonelier in some ways, but it was also liberating. She threw herself into her work, pouring all her energy into her career. It helped that she was financially secure, far more so than Richard. She made 3 times his income, a fact that had always bothered him more than it ever did her. Still, the hurt lingered. It was hard to trust again, to open herself up to the idea of someone new. That's when she met Teddy. He wasn't like Richard. Where Richard was charismatic and outgoing, Teddy was shy, reserved. He worked in IT, and when he came to her office to fix a computer issue, they bonded over something as simple as binary code, 1s and 0s. At first, it was just small talk. Then, over the weeks, they found themselves lingering longer in conversation, and Ilene began to look forward to his visits. Teddy had a softness about him, a quiet kindness that she hadn't realized she was missing. One day, Teddy shyly asked her out, his cheeks turning red as he stumbled over the words. Ilene's heart swelled, but at the same time, she felt a familiar pang of sadness. I can't, she said softly, the words hurting her more than they should. Teddy's face fell, but he nodded, understanding in his eyes. It's okay, he said, his voice gentle. I get it. Richard, for all his flaws, wasn't ready to let Ilene go. After months of separation, he convinced her to give their marriage one more shot. He promised counseling, change, anything she wanted if she would just give him a chance. And for a time, Ilene considered it. She didn't want to fail, didn't want to look back on 15 years of marriage and see it as a waste. They went to counseling. They talked. They tried to rebuild what had been shattered, but there was always a part of her that couldn't forgive him. That night, his request, his betrayal, was a constant shadow over them. One day, out of the blue, Ilene received a text message. It was from Teddy. His words were simple, but they struck her deeply. I've been thinking about you. Ilene stared at the screen, her heart pounding as she read the message over and over again. It was everything she had wanted to hear, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to smile. As time passed, Ilene found herself at a crossroads. Richard was still trying, still begging for another chance, but her heart had shifted. What had once been clear, the desire to save her marriage, was now clouded by the reality that she deserved more. More than just being someone's second option. More than living in the shadow of someone else's desires. Teddy's message had awakened something in her. The possibility of happiness, of a future untainted by betrayal and mistrust, felt within reach. She had been afraid to grasp it, but now, as she stood on the precipice of a new chapter in her life, she knew she was ready. Ilene sat in her car, staring at her phone, her thumb hovering over the message thread with Teddy. It had been weeks since his text, the one that had made her smile despite the weight of her crumbling marriage. She had resisted the urge to respond, too afraid of what might come next, but tonight, something felt different. She was tired of being trapped in the cycle of trying to salvage something broken beyond repair. She inhaled deeply, then finally typed out the message. "Hey, Teddy, would you like to grab a coffee sometime?" She stared at the words for a moment, her pulse racing. Then, with a single tap, she hit send. Seconds stretched into minutes as she waited for a reply. Each moment felt like an eternity. She tried not to think about what would happen if he said no, or worse, if he didn't respond at all. A soft chime pulled her from her thoughts. A message had come through. Her heart skipped as she opened it. "Hey, Ilene, I'd love to, but I've just started seeing someone. Timing, I guess." Her heart sank and the world felt cold again. Teddy's words were kind, but they stung in ways she hadn't expected. The door she thought might reopen had been quietly shut, and she found herself more alone than ever. She stared at the message, biting her lip to keep her emotions in check. "Of course," she replied quickly, masking her disappointment with politeness. "Thanks for letting me know. I hope it works out." 2 weeks later, Ilene packed her belongings and moved out of the house she had shared with Richard for 15 years. It had been a slow process, both physically and emotionally, but she knew she had to leave. The memories in that house were too painful, too tainted by his betrayal. Every corner, every piece of furniture, every photo hanging on the wall felt like a reminder of what had been lost. As the movers carried the last box to the truck, Ilene stood in the empty living room, taking one final look around. The silence was oppressive, and she felt an overwhelming sense of finality. The divorce was finalized a week later. Richard didn't fight her on any of it. He had pleaded, begged for a second chance, but Ilene had remained resolute. She was done. She had given him too many chances already. What she didn't expect was for him to turn to her family and friends. Within days of the divorce papers being signed, her phone started buzzing incessantly. First it was her sister, then her best friend, then her mother. All of them had the same concerned tone, the same message. "Ilene, we're worried about you. Richard said you're not doing well. Richard came by. He's concerned about your mental health. Are you okay?" Ilene had never felt more betrayed. It was bad enough that Richard had gone behind her back to discuss her private pain with the people closest to her. But the fact that they all believed him made it worse. They showed up at her door, uninvited, offering unwanted advice, telling her how she needed to focus on healing and how they just wanted to help. But no one could help, not in the way she needed. All she wanted was to be left alone to wallow in her misery, to grieve for the life she thought she'd have, the love she thought would last forever. 2 months passed in a blur of sadness and solitude. Ilene's world had become smaller and quieter. She went to work, came home, and avoided social gatherings. Her friends and family eventually stopped calling, realizing she needed space. The loneliness was suffocating, but at least it was hers. It was a regular Tuesday afternoon when something shifted. Ilene was sitting at her desk, her focus on a spreadsheet that required more attention than she could muster. A soft knock at her office door startled her, and she glanced up, expecting one of her coworkers. But it wasn't. There, standing in the doorway, was Teddy. Her heart leapt in her chest at the sight of him. He looked the same as always, slightly awkward, shy, but with a gentle warmth in his eyes. "Teddy," she managed to say, trying to steady her voice. He offered a small smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Hey, Ilene, I have a work order for your system," he explained hesitantly, glancing down at the tablet in his hands. Ilene blinked, taken aback. "For my system?" He nodded, stepping inside the office. "Yeah, my boss sent me over." The air between them felt charged, heavy with unspoken words. She couldn't tell if the work order was real or just an excuse to see her, but she didn't care. All she knew was that seeing Teddy again, after all this time, felt like a lifeline being thrown into the sea of her despair. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Teddy cleared his throat, shifting on his feet. "I know it's been a while," he started, his voice soft. "And I know we didn't really get a chance to, talk, but I've been thinking about you." Eileen's heart fluttered at his words. "I've been thinking about you too," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Teddy looked down at the tablet again, as if it could shield him from the vulnerability of the moment. "I don't know where things stand for you now. I'm not with that person anymore. It didn't really work out." Eileen's chest tightened. The flood of emotions was too much to contain. She had been drowning in loneliness, and now, here was Teddy, offering her a chance at something she thought she'd lost forever. "I'm glad you're here," she said, her voice trembling slightly. I've missed you." Teddy's eyes met hers, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Eileen saw hope reflected back at her. He set down the tablet, taking a tentative step closer. "I've missed you too." Teddy sat across from Eileen at a small cafe near her office. The air between them hummed with an unspoken tension, a mixture of hope and hesitation. They had been talking for an hour, but neither of them had touched the subject that hung heavily over their heads. Finally, Teddy broke the silence. "I have to tell you something," he said, his voice low. He leaned forward, clasping his hands together on the table. "That day I showed up at your office, there wasn't a work order." Eileen blinked, momentarily thrown off. "There wasn't?" Teddy shook his head, looking slightly embarrassed. "No, I wanted an excuse to see you. I couldn't stop thinking about you, and I didn't know how else to approach you." She felt her heart swell at the confession, warmth spreading through her chest. There had been something undeniably sincere in his arrival that day, and now, knowing the truth, it felt like more than just a simple visit. "But," Teddy continued, "there's more. I went on 2 dates with that other woman I mentioned. She's nice, but..." He trailed off, shaking his head again. "She was loud, overwhelming. I realized what I missed was the quiet moments I had with you. Our talks, the way we could just sit together and not fill every moment with noise." Eileen's breath caught. She hadn't known what to expect from this conversation, but the vulnerability in Teddy's words touched her deeply. "I don't know if there's anything here, Eileen," he said quietly, meeting her gaze, "but I hope you'll give me the chance to find out." Eileen's chest tightened, emotions swirling inside her. She wanted to give him that chance. She wanted to see where this could go, but part of her was still raw, still unsure. "Of course," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "We can try." For a few blissful weeks, things seemed to be looking up. Eileen and Teddy fell into a rhythm, spending quiet evenings together, talking about everything and nothing. They didn't label it, didn't rush anything, but there was an undeniable connection forming between them. They had never even kissed, preferring to take it slow, to get to know one another, and to learn about each other before they took it deeper. They had held hands, and their friendship was starting to feel like more. That was, until Richard found out. One evening, as Eileen sat at her kitchen table scrolling through her emails, her phone buzzed with a text from Teddy. "Hey, can we talk? Something's come up." Her stomach twisted. There was an ominous tone in his words, and she quickly typed out a reply, asking if everything was okay. When they met at the park the next day, Teddy looked different, tense, uncertain. He sat beside her on the bench, his hands shoved into his pockets, staring out at the children playing in the distance. "Richard reached out to me," he said finally. Eileen's heart plummeted. "What?" she asked, her voice thick with disbelief. Teddy nodded, his jaw clenched. "He called me, said he wanted to warn me. He told me things about you, Eileen. About how controlling you can be, how demanding you are. He painted this picture of someone who always gets her way, no matter the cost." Eileen stared at him, stunned. Anger and hurt twisted inside her. But mostly, there was a deep sense of betrayal. Richard hadn't just blown up their marriage. Now he was trying to sabotage her future, too. "I can't believe he did that," she whispered. "Teddy, you know that's not who I am." "I do," he said quickly, turning toward her. "I don't believe him. But..." Eileen's breath caught. There it was. The hesitation. "But my last relationship was with someone who used me, Eileen. She took advantage of me, and I didn't see it until it was too late. I swore I'd never put myself in that position again. And now, with Richard planting these seeds in my head, Teddy trailed off, rubbing his temples in frustration. I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I'm strong enough to take that chance again. Eileen swallowed hard, her heart breaking a little more with every word. She wanted to fight for this, but she couldn't change the past or the damage Richard had done. All she could do was let Teddy make his own choice, even if it hurt. I understand, she said softly, her voice trembling. Teddy looked at her, pain flickering in his eyes. Eileen, it's okay, she said, forcing a sad smile. I get it. You have to do what feels right for you. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, with a reluctant sigh, Teddy stood up from the bench. Eileen stayed seated, staring at the ground, her heart heavy. Goodbye, Teddy, she whispered. He nodded, his expression conflicted, and started to walk away. She watched him, knowing that this was the end. Or at least, it should have been. But then, just as he reached the edge of the park, Teddy stopped. This feels wrong, she thought she heard him mutter. Eileen's breath caught as she watched him turn around, hesitating for a moment before walking back toward her with determined strides. Without saying a word, he stopped in front of her, reached out, and gently cupped the side of her face in his hand. Eileen's eyes widened in surprise, her heart racing as Teddy leaned in and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was soft, tender, and filled with a kind of longing that took her breath away. When he finally pulled back, his thumb brushing lightly against her cheek, his eyes searched hers. I knew it would be like that, he whispered. Eileen blinked, still dazed. Like what? Teddy smiled, the first real smile she had seen from him in days. Like the earth moved under my feet. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, slowly, a small smile tugged at Eileen's lips, and for the first time in what felt like forever, hope bloomed in her chest again. Teddy had refused to let Richard ruin the feelings that were building between them, and so would she. Eileen had just settled into the evening, sipping tea on her couch, when her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. She hesitated before opening it, her mind immediately jumping to all the unwanted possibilities. Spam, another work notification, or worse, something from Richard. But the message was unexpected. Hi Eileen, it's Vivian. I know this is probably the last thing you want, but I was hoping we could talk, please. Eileen stared at the text, her chest tightening. Vivian? She had thought about the other woman often, but she never imagined hearing from her. What did she want? After a few minutes of debating, Eileen's fingers moved over the screen. Fine. Where? Vivian responded almost immediately, suggesting a coffee shop in the middle of town. With a sense of dread curling in her stomach, Eileen agreed. The cafe was quiet when Eileen walked in, the warm smell of freshly brewed coffee masking the tension swirling inside her. She spotted Vivian at a small table in the corner, her eyes shifting nervously to the door every few seconds. When their eyes met, Eileen saw something unexpected. Guilt. Vivian stood as Eileen approached, awkwardly gesturing toward the seat across from her. Thanks for meeting me. Eileen slid into the chair, her expression guarded. What do you want, Vivian? Vivian swallowed hard, fiddling with the edge of her coffee cup. I'm not here to cause any more trouble, I promise. I need to clear the air. Eileen raised an eyebrow but said nothing, waiting for her to continue. I'm sure you know that Richard and I were together for a while, Vivian began, her voice shaky. What you don't know is that it wasn't just during that open marriage period he asked you for. Eileen's stomach twisted, a bitter taste rising in her throat. What are you talking about? Vivian took a deep breath. We were seeing each other for 3 years, Eileen, long before he asked to open the marriage. 3 years. The words hit Eileen like a punch to the gut, knocking the breath from her lungs. She stared at Vivian, trying to process the confession. She had always suspected that Richard's affair with Vivian wasn't as simple as he made it seem. But 3 years? That was a different kind of betrayal. 3 years? Eileen whispered, her voice barely audible. Vivian nodded, guilt flashing in her eyes. Yes, I didn't know about you at first, I swear. He told me he was unhappy, that you were distant, that your marriage was falling apart. By the time I found out the truth, I was already in too deep. Eileen gritted her teeth, anger bubbling up inside her. And you didn't think to walk away? To confront him? I did, Vivian said quickly, her hands trembling. I tried. A few months ago, I gave him an ultimatum. I told him he had to choose, me or you. I thought he had chosen me. He started staying overnight, and I thought we were finally in a real relationship, but... Vivian's voice cracked, and she shook her head. What I didn't know was that every time he left my place, he was going home to you. He was living a double life, Eileen. Eileen closed her eyes, the weight of Vivian's words pressing down on her. It was worse than she thought, so much worse. All those nights when she had trusted him, when she had believed his lies about working late or being away for business, all of it had been a sham. After your divorce, Vivian continued, her voice soft, he moved in with me. But it didn't last. She paused, glancing away as if embarrassed. He started seeing other women. A bitter laugh escaped Eileen's lips before she could stop it. Of course he did. Vivian's face crumpled and she looked down at the table. I thought he loved me. I thought I was different. But the truth is, Richard can't be loyal to anyone. Not me. Not you. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Eileen's heart was pounding, the anger simmering in her chest. She had known Richard was selfish, but hearing it from Vivian, hearing the full extent of his deceit, felt like reopening a wound she had barely begun to heal. I don't know what you expect me to say, Eileen finally muttered, crossing her arms. You knew what you were doing, Vivian. You knew you were with a married man, and you stayed. I should be furious with you, and I am, but honestly, I feel sorry for you too. Vivian's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded. I deserve that. I needed you to know the truth. And maybe, she added, her voice small, I needed to hear it from someone else that I wasn't the only one he did this to. Eileen sighed, running a hand through her hair. Well, now you know. Vivian nodded again, wiping her eyes. Thank you for listening. I'm sorry, Eileen, for everything. Without waiting for a response, Vivian stood and hurried out of the cafe, leaving Eileen sitting there in stunned silence. As the door swung shut behind her, Eileen let out a long, shaky breath. She should have felt vindicated. In a way, she did. Knowing the full extent of Richard's betrayal gave her some measure of closure. But at the same time, it left her with an overwhelming sense of anger. At herself, at Richard, and at the years she had wasted trying to salvage something that had been broken long before she knew it. She had trusted him. She had believed in their marriage, and he had lied over and over again. Eileen picked up her phone, scrolling through her contacts until she found her therapist's number. It was time to talk to someone, to unpack the emotions swirling inside her. Because while Richard and his lies were behind her, the damage he had done still lingered. It was time to heal, for real this time. Eileen stood on the step stool, hanging a framed print on the wall of their new living room, adjusting it until it was perfectly straight. Behind her, Teddy was rummaging through a box, muttering something about never finding the right screws when he needed them. She couldn't help but smile. The sun streamed through the large windows, casting golden light across the hardwood floors, making the whole space feel warm and inviting, like home, their home. It still felt surreal, this new chapter of her life. A year ago, she could never have imagined this. A quiet life with Teddy, surrounded by love and warmth, far removed from the chaos and betrayal she had once known. How does this look? She called, stepping down to admire her handiwork. Teddy looked up from the box, his eyes softening when they met hers. Perfect, just like everything else you do. Eileen laughed, crossing the room to give him a playful nudge. You're biased. Maybe, he said with a grin, pulling her close and planting a kiss on her forehead. But I'm also right. She leaned into his embrace, her heart swelling with a contentment she hadn't felt in years. Together, they had filled their new home with laughter, love, and countless little pieces of their lives. It was a space that felt uniquely theirs, full of possibility and hope. As she rested her head against his chest, her mind wandered to how she had gotten here. It had been a long, painful journey, one filled with heartbreak, deception, and self-discovery. Richard's betrayal had nearly destroyed her, leaving her questioning everything she thought she knew about love and trust. But out of that darkness had come something beautiful, Teddy, and with him, the promise of a future she hadn't even dared to dream of. Are you okay? Teddy asked, his voice gentle, sensing her moment of reflection. She pulled back slightly, looking up at him with a soft smile. Yeah, I'm more than okay. I was just thinking about how far we've come, how far I've come. Teddy's expression turned thoughtful. You've been through a lot, Eileen, but you've come out of it stronger and, well, I'm just grateful I get to be part of this new chapter with you. Eileen felt a lump rise in her throat. I'm grateful too, she whispered. You've been my rock, Teddy. I never thought I'd find someone like you after everything with Richard. At the mention of Richard's name, they both paused for a moment, as if remembering the man who had once cast such a long shadow over Eileen's life. But now, that shadow was gone, and Richard, Well, Richard was nothing more than a distant, painful memory. Or so she thought, until Teddy suddenly chuckled, pulling a folded newspaper from one of the boxes. "Speaking of Richard," he said, handing her the paper, "look at this." Ilene took the newspaper from him, her brow furrowing as she unfolded it. There, in the local news section, was a small but satisfying notice. Local man arrested in public scandal. Richard Wesley, former corporate executive, was arrested after a public altercation at a popular restaurant. Witnesses say he became belligerent with staff and patrons after being refused service. Wesley, whose recent financial troubles have been widely speculated, was escorted out in handcuffs. Sources close to the investigation say he had been living beyond his means following a costly divorce, leading to his downfall. Eileen's eyes widened as she read the article, a mixture of shock and amusement bubbling up inside her. "Oh my God, he's really hit rock bottom, hasn't he?" Teddy couldn't contain his laughter as he leaned over her shoulder to read. "I guess karma finally caught up with him." Eileen shook her head in disbelief, though she couldn't help but laugh too. After everything Richard had put her through, the lies, the manipulation, the infidelity, seeing him face the consequences of his own actions felt strangely cathartic. She wasn't the type to gloat, but she couldn't deny that a part of her felt vindicated. "Well," she said with a shrug, folding the paper and setting it aside, "he made his choices. Now he's dealing with the fallout." Teddy wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "And you, Eileen, have made your choices too. Better ones. Look at where you are now. Look at us." Eileen leaned back into him, feeling the warmth of his embrace and the truth of his words. She had chosen to walk away from the pain, to embrace the unknown, and to take a chance on happiness with someone who saw her for who she truly was. And here she was, standing in the home they had built together, filled with love and laughter. Richard's story had ended in scandal and regret, but hers was just beginning. And as she stood there, surrounded by the man she loved and the life they were building, Eileen knew without a doubt that she had finally found her happily ever after. "To new beginnings," she whispered, turning in Teddy's arms to kiss him softly. "To us," Teddy replied, smiling against her lips. As they held each other in the quiet of their new home, Eileen couldn't help but think about how far she had come. Life had a funny way of working out, and despite all the pain, she had found something worth fighting for: herself, her happiness, and the love she had always deserved. And now, with Teddy by her side, she was finally home.
Thank you so much for joining us on this emotional journey through Eileen's life. From the heartbreak of her past to the hope and happiness she found in her new beginning, we hope her story has touched your heart as much as it has ours. If you enjoyed this complete edition of Eileen's journey, please give it a thumbs up and share it with friends and family who might find it inspiring. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that resonate and captivate. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What part of Eileen's journey moved you the most? And if you have any suggestions for future stories or topics, we're all ears. Thank you for watching, and we look forward to sharing more incredible stories with you soon.